All right, so you guys requested a deep dive into Herbert Mullin. And let me tell you, this one, it really gets under your skin. We're talking about a serial killer. Operated in California, early 70s, responsible for 13 deaths. But here's the thing.
Yeah,
His motive
it wasn't the usual.
wasn't your typical revenge or power grab at
No,
all.
not even close. Mullen genuinely believed, that his murders were preventing earthquakes.
Yeah, you heard that right. He thought he was, like, saving lives by taking them. And to make things even more crazy, his spree happened to overlap with
Oh, yeah?
Edmund Kemper.
Edmund Kemper, the co-ed killer.
Talk about a confusing time
Right.
for investigators.
Oh, absolutely. It's a truly bizarre, period in California's history. Two totally different personalities committing these horrific crimes at the same time.
Exactly. So for this deep dive, we've got biographical info, we've got articles, we even have some chilling insights from Kemper himself
Wow.
to try and piece together this puzzle.
That's incredible.
We're going to try to unravel the complexities of Herbert Mullin, his life, his descent into, what can only be described as madness, and the chilling details of his crimes. So let's start with his early life. On the surface, it seems like a stark contrast to the horrors that he would commit. Born in 1947, grew up in California. Seems like ordinary beginning, right?
Yeah, it's the kind of background that makes these cases so puzzling. But, when you look closer, you start to see the cracks. Even in high school, he was voted most likely to succeed. But at the same time, he was battling what we now understand to be undiagnosed paranoid schizophrenia.
Whoa, wait, so even back then, there were signs
There were signs, but it wasn't recognized at the time.
of a troubled mind?
Absolute. Paranoid schizophrenia is, well, it's a complex mental disorder. It really distorts a person's thinking, their perceptions of the world. Imagine a world where your internal thoughts feel as real as external reality.
That's terrifying.
It's a very scary thought.
And it only got worse from there, right?
Tragically, yeah. The death of a close friend in a car accident. That had a really profound impact on him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it triggered this obsession with reincarnation. It seems like that loss, combined with the schizophrenia, really set his grip on reality spiraling.
So we're talking about a pre-existing vulnerability
Yeah,
coupled with a major life trauma.
exactly. And unfortunately, his mental health just continued to deteriorate. Multiple stays in mental hospitals, eventually a formal diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, and then heavy drug use came into play.
Oh, no.
Yeah, particularly LSD and cannabis just exacerbated his condition.
This is where I start to wonder about societal influences, you know? The early 70s were such a turbulent time,
Right.
especially in California. Vietnam War, counterculture movement, there was a lot of unrest, a lot of anxiety in the air.
That's a really good point. It's so crucial to remember that individual psychology doesn't exist in a vacuum.
Right.
Mellon, he fixated on the Vietnam War, but he interpreted it through this, deeply distorted lens.
So you're saying that the broader context of the time
Oh, absolutely.
might have actually played a role in shaping his delusions?
It's very possible. He saw the war as this form of blood sacrifice, like a way to appease nature and prevent earthquakes.
Whoa.
So as the war was winding down, he felt this personal responsibility to continue this, perceived sacrifice. It's a chilling example of how real-world events can get twisted by a mind consumed by illness.
Wow. And then there's the eerie detail about his birthday, right?
Oh, yes, Herbert Mullin was born on April 18th, the anniversary of that devastating 1906 San Francisco earthquake.
Oh my gosh.
It wasn't just a date for him. It became this morbid fixation. He felt tethered to it, convinced that it held some kind of cosmic significance.
It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy in his mind, almost.
Exactly. So all of these seemingly disparate elements, the schizophrenia, the trauma of his friend's death, the societal anxieties of the time, and then this morbid connection to the earthquake, they all converged within his psyche, and it formed this really dangerous and ultimately tragic cocktail.
It's like all the ingredients for a nightmare were already there, just simmering beneath the surface.
Yeah.
And then in October of 1972, it boiled over. His first victim, 55-year-old transient named Lawrence Whitey White.
Mullin lured White in with a story about car trouble. Fabricated story.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was calculated. It was brutal. He beat White to death with a baseball bat.
Pretending to need help
Yeah.
only to inflict violence, that's so disturbing.
It's a tough one.
Was this a random act?
It's hard to say for sure.
Or was White somehow connected to Mullin's
I mean,
worldview?
his later murders were definitely tied to his delusions.
Right.
But that first one,
Yeah.
it remains a bit of an enigma.
And it was just the beginning of his horrifying spree, right?
Sadly, yes. Just a few weeks later, his next victim was a college student, Mary Margaret Guilfoyle.
Tell me about that one.
Well, he offered her a ride, and then he stabbed her to death while they were driving.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. But then it gets even more unsettling. He took her body to this secluded area and dissected it. Mullin was consumed by this idea that the environment was being polluted, and he was searching for evidence of this pollution in her body.
This is where it crosses over from violence into something truly monstrous.
It's the point where the depths of his delusion become really apparent. He wasn't just killing anymore. He was engaging in these acts that reflected this, like, warped internal reality that he was living in.
And what's so striking is that right after this, he tried to confess at a Catholic church.
Yeah.
Was he seeking forgiveness? Redemption?
It's hard to know his true intentions.
Right.
He claimed that the priest, Father Henri Tomé, actually offered to be his next sacrifice, but we have no way to verify that.
Okay, so either way,
Yeah.
Father Tomé became Mullin's next victim. It's like he desperately wanted someone to validate his, like, twisted mission, even if it meant forcing their participation.
It's a fascinating interpretation, and it really raises the question, was he seeking affirmation, or was he seeking a confrontation that would, solidify his role as a savior?
Right, like, he needed that pushback to justify his actions. It's almost like he was looking for someone to stop him,
Yeah.
to tell him he was wrong.
Right.
But when no one did,
When no one did,
he took it as a sign to continue.
a sign that he was truly on the right path, as horrific as it was. And, his next act is maybe the most perplexing of all. He tried to join the Marines.
The Marines.
Yeah.
Why? That seems so out of character for someone already committing murders.
It is a strange twist. It seems like he was searching for this, like, socially acceptable outlet for his violent urges, some way to channel this perceived duty into something, I don't know, sanctioned by society.
But obviously that didn't pan out.
No, he was rejected. And that rejection, likely fueled his downward spiral, pushed him further into isolation and delusion.
So at this point, Mullin is firmly entrenched in his psychosis, convinced he needs to kill to save the world from earthquakes.
Yeah.
He's already taken 3 lives.
Right.
And his spree's far from over.
Unfortunately, you're right. He's about to embark on a series of murders that are just going to shock even those, I don't know, hardened investigators.
Okay, I'm ready to hear about it, as difficult as it may be.
All right.
What happened next?
Mullin's paranoia, it just got worse and worse, and he became fixated on this idea that his past drug use was to blame for everything.
So he was looking for a scapegoat, huh? Someone to blame for his problem.
Yeah, exactly.
Makes sense.
And he landed on this guy, Jim Gianera, a former high school friend, actually,
Oh,
who
wow.
had introduced him to cannabis years earlier.
His own friend. It's hard to believe that something as simple as, sharing an oint could lead to something so awful.
I know. It's really speaks to the twisted logic of Mullin's, delusions.
Yeah.
He went to Gianera's cabin, demanding to know why he had been exposed to drugs.
Oh, man. This confrontation, it couldn't have ended well, could it?
It was a tragedy waiting to happen. Mullin he shot Gianera, and then he turned the gun on Joan, Gianera's wife, who was also at the cabin.
2 more lives lost because of this wolf sense of blame. It didn't stop there, though, did it?
It didn't, no. Driven by this chilling mix of paranoia and delusion, Mullin left the Gianera cabin and went to another location where he murdered Kathy Francis and her 2 children, Demon and David.
A whole family gone. It's almost unbearable to think about the brutality, the shooting, the stabbing. It's hard to square those actions with the, seemingly ordinary young man described by his classmates.
It is. It's a stark reminder that the human mind is capable of such incredible good, but also horrifying evil.
Yeah.
And in Mullin's case, the line between what was real and what wasn't, it was totally gone.
Did the police connect these murders to his previous ones? It seems like the violence was escalating so rapidly.
Not at first. The murders at the Gianera cabin, they were so brutal that investigators thought it had to be drug-related violence. They couldn't imagine that a clean-cut young man like Mullin was capable of something like that.
So he was still flying under the radar.
He was, and his reign of terror wasn't over yet. His next victims were 4 teenage boys who were camping in Santa Cruz. And there's a really creepy thing about this one.
Oh, what's that?
Well, the day before the murders, Mullin actually ran into these boys while they were setting up camp.
Really?
Yeah, he pretended to be a park ranger, told them they were polluting the forest, and ordered them to leave.
So he actually interacted with them before killing them. That's chilling.
It adds this whole other level of, like premeditation to his actions. Like
Right.
he was, I don't know, testing the waters,
Wow.
rehearsing his role.
Yeah.
The boys, of course, they didn't take him seriously and stayed at their campsite.
And Mullin came back the next day to carry out his plan.
He did. He shot all 4 of them in the head and then stole their rifle and money. It really shows you how lost in his delusions he was. He was completely detached from any sense of morality or empathy at that point.
It's almost as if he was playing a character in this, like, macabre play of his own making.
It's a terrifying thought,
Yeah.
and I think it gets to the heart of what makes Mullin's case so disturbing. His actions weren't motivated by, personal gain or revenge or even sadism. He really believed he was saving the world.
It makes it even more unsettling, because it's not a motive that we can easily wrap our heads around.
Right, it challenges our whole understanding of human nature.
Yeah.
But in the middle of all this horror, there was one final act of violence that led to Mullin finally being caught.
Oh, okay, tell me about it.
So his last murder was maybe his most brazen. He shot and killed a retired prizefighter named Fred Addy Perez in broad daylight, while Perez was gardening in his yard.
He was getting bolder with each crime, more impulsive. Did anyone witness it?
Luckily, yeah, a neighbor saw the whole thing and immediately reported Mullin's license plate to the police.
Wow, that must have been a huge break in the case, after chasing shadows for months.
It was. A patrolman spotted Mullin's car a short while later and pulled him over.
I can't imagine what that officer must have been thinking, pulling over this seemingly harmless guy, only to find out he was responsible for all these murders.
It must have been surreal. And looking back, it's amazing how all these different things, the seemingly random nature of the crimes, Edmund Kemper's spree happening at the same time, it all just hindered the investigation.
It really is mind-boggling that these two notorious serial killers were operating in the same area at the same time.
Yeah, a perfect storm of circumstances that allowed Mullin to evade capture for as long as he did.
But with his arrest, the full scope of his crimes was finally revealed.
It was.
And then the question became, what would happen to him? Would he face justice, or would his mental state, protect him from the full consequences of his actions?
That's where the story takes another turn. The legal battle that followed, it really dives into the complexities of mental illness and the criminal justice system.
Okay, so let's break that down. What happened after Mullin was arrested?
Well, he admitted to all of the murders right away,
Mm-hmm.
but the focus of the case quickly shifted to his sanity.
Right, because if he was found legally insane, then he wouldn't be held responsible in the same way.
Exactly, it became this battle of the experts. The prosecution, led by Chris Cottle, they wanted to prove that Mullin was aware of what he was doing, that he knew the difference between right and wrong. And they pointed to his attempts to cover his tracks, the premeditation in some of the killings.
So they were arguing that even with his mental illness, he was still making deliberate choices.
Yeah, that's right. They were painting a picture of him as this calculated killer, not a man solely driven by delusion.
And what about the defense? What was their approach?
Mullin's public defender, Jim Jackson, took a completely different approach. He argued that Mullin's delusions were so powerful, so overwhelming, that they basically, took away his ability to reason.
So they were presenting him as a victim of his own mind.
Exactly, yeah. A man who was basically driven to kill by forces that he couldn't control.
It was a classic battle between free will and, determinism, all playing out in the courtroom with a confessed killer's life hanging in the balance.
It must have been incredibly intense.
Yeah,
And the jury, they had this incredibly difficult job.
right.
They had to consider all the evidence, listen to the expert testimony, and decide whether Herbert Mullin was a cold-blooded killer who deserved to be punished or a mentally ill man who needed help, not punishment.
So what was the verdict? So the jury had a big decision to make. Was he guilty and facing a harsh sentence or not guilty by reason of insanity?
Right.
And committed to a psychiatric facility?
It's a tough call.
What a weight on their shoulders.
Yeah.
What did they decide?
They found him guilty of first-degree murder for 2 of the killings, Jim Gennara and Kathy Francis.
So for those ones, the jury felt like his actions were planned out, even if they were fueled by delusion.
Yeah, probably. But for the other killings, the jury found him guilty of second-degree murder.
Interesting. So they saw those as maybe more impulsive, driven by his psychosis.
Right.
It's fascinating how the system tries to make those distinctions.
Yeah.
Premedication versus impulse, sane or insane. But it sounds like, regardless, Mullin was going to prison.
That's right. He was sentenced to life. And over the years, he had 8 parole requests denied. He stayed in prison until he died in 2022.
Wait, he died? I didn't realize he wasn't still alive.
Yep, Herbert Mullin died of natural causes at 75 years old.
Wow, so he spent decades behind bars. Did he ever, express any remorse for what he did?
No, not really. Even after all those years, he continued to say that his killings were justified, that he was saving the environment.
It's just there's no real sense of closure, is there? No clear answers.
It's a case that definitely raises more questions than it answers. But, there is one detail that kept coming back to me as I was researching this case.
Okay, what's that?
It has to do with Edmund Kemper, the other serial killer who was operating in California at the same time.
Yeah, their paths crossed in a very real way. More than just geographically, right?
Exactly. Remember, they shared a cell for a while?
Oh, yeah. What are the odds? Two of California's most notorious serial killers locked up right next to each other. What was that like?
Well, we actually have some insight from Kemper himself. He's given interviews from prison,
Oh, wow.
and he had some strong opinions about Mullin.
Like what?
Kemper seemed to view Mullin with, I don't know, disdain, almost disgust.
Really? I wonder if it was some sort of like a rivalry, a weird, twisted professional rivalry.
Yeah, maybe on some level, but Kemper, as twisted as he was, he had what he considered a moral code. He saw himself as killing, quote-unquote, bad people, people who had wronged him or society.
He thought he was ridding the world of bad people. That's terrifying.
It is. But here's what's interesting. Kemper saw Mullin's killings as totally pointless, fueled by paranoia. He thought there was no purpose to them at all, no rhyme or reason.
Wow, so even Edmund Kemper, a serial killer, had a line he wouldn't cross.
It seems like it.
It's a strange thing to think about, you know? A hierarchy of evil, even within the world of serial killers.
Right. And Kemper's attitude toward Mullin, I think it raises a question for us, as we try to understand these cases. How do we confront evil as a society? How do we punish it? And maybe even more important, how do we prevent it?
That's the question, isn't it? And I don't think there are any easy answers, especially in a case like Mullin's.
I agree. But Mullin's story, it does highlight the importance of getting help for mental health issues early on.
Absolutely.
If he'd gotten the help he needed earlier, maybe his life and the lives of his victims would have been different.
It's a good reminder that mental health is just as important as physical health, and there shouldn't be any shame in getting help.
I completely agree. Another takeaway for me is the importance of critical thinking. Mullin, he was just consumed by these conspiracy theories. His mind clung to ideas that reinforced his delusions.
It's a good point. Not everything we read or hear is true, is it? We have to be careful about what we believe.
Exactly. I think that's where deep dives like this can help.
Yeah.
By exploring these cases openly, talking about mental health, we can hopefully shift the conversation in a positive direction.
Right. It's about facing the darkness, not being afraid of it. And it's about learning from these tragedies so we can try to prevent them from happening in the future.
Absolutely. Herbert Mullin's case shows us that the human mind is capable of both amazing things and terrible things. By understanding what drives us, by recognizing the complexity of mental health, and by building a culture of empathy and support, well, maybe we can work towards a world where tragedies like this are less common.
This has been a really heavy conversation, but so important. Thank you for guiding us through it.
Of course.
And to you listening, thank you for joining us for this deep dive. I hope you learned something. I hope it made you think and maybe even inspired you to learn more about this case. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep trying to understand. I need to tell yourself.